When 17-year-old Jaylen Prescott walked into Courtroom 2B at the Maricopa County Courthouse, Judge Wexler's immediate reaction was a dismissive, "Take that hood off, son. This isn't a rap video." The courtroom, half full, buzzed with murmurs and quiet laughter. Even the bailiff struggled to suppress a smirk. But Jaylen didn't flinch. He calmly pulled back his faded gray hoodie, revealing short, twisted hair and sharp, unblinking dark eyes. Dressed in black jeans and scuffed sneakers, he looked more like he was there for a truancy hearing than a legal battle. He walked directly to the plaintiff's table, dropped his backpack and sat down as if he belonged. Across from him sat the defense attorney, a man in his mid-40s with a tailored navy suit, silver glasses, and a smug look that screamed, "This won't take long." Judge Wexler, clearly annoyed, leaned forward. "Are you lost, Mr. Prescott?" "Jaylen Prescott. I'm here representing my cousin, Ms. Tiana Rowe, in her civil claim, case number 2023 CV7. The courtroom fell silent. "You're what now?" Wexler's voice rose slightly. "I am her legal representative, pro se appointment. All documents were submitted and approved last Friday." Jaylen pulled a neatly clipped file from his backpack and held it up. The bailiff, still eyeing him suspiciously, carried it to the bench. Wexler adjusted his glasses and flipped through the papers. "Approved. Judge's signature and all." "All right," Wexler sighed, setting the file aside. "We're doing circus acts now?" "Sure, you watched a few episodes of Law and Order and now you're Clarence Darrow." "Fine, let's pretend this isn't absurd." The audience chuckled again, low and sharp. Jaylen, however, remained unfazed. He opened his own case file, scribbled on a yellow notepad and waited. The defense attorney stood, clearing his throat. "Your Honor, we're happy to proceed, but for the record, we reserve the right to request a dismissal based on the plaintiff's decision to be represented by a minor." Wexler waved him off with a half-laugh. "Let the boy make a fool of himself. He wants the spotlight, let's see what he does with it." That's when Jaylen looked up, his gaze steady. "Before we proceed, Your Honor, may I verify that opposing counsel has disclosed all documentation related to the February 8th lease violation? The emails, photos, timestamp notices." The room stilled again. Wexler blinked. The defense attorney hesitated. Those weren't included in initial discovery due to timing issues, so they were omitted." "Despite being material to the central claim?" Jaylen interjected calmly. Wexler looked between them. The defense attorney straightened his tie, suddenly uncomfortable. "I'll allow a 5-minute recess for you to produce the missing documentation," Wexler muttered, frowning. "Don't make a habit of cutting corners." Jaylen sat back, nodded, and made another note. The courtroom already felt different. The silence was now curiosity. Jaylen Prescott was born in South Phoenix, just blocks from his cousin Tiana's apartment complex, a place of peeling paint and broken mailboxes. It wasn't the kind of neighborhood where civil court was a common topic, but his mother, Patrice, a pediatric clinic front desk worker for 16 years, made sure he understood the value of hard work and financial responsibility. His father had left when Jaylen was 5, leaving behind bills and a half-packed suitcase. Jaylen wasn't bitter, but he learned early that no one was coming to save them. He was a quiet kid in school, often found scribbling in the margins of his notebooks, a hoodie pulled up. Teachers thought he wasn't paying attention, but he was, just not to them. When his uncle's parking violation spiraled into a bogus resisting charge, Jaylen started reading. Not just articles, but court transcripts, city ordinances, and Supreme Court summaries on Google Scholar. What began as anger evolved into interest, then obsession. By 15 he could recite Arizona's tenant laws from memory. At 16 he was drafting sample responses to eviction notices for practice. While other kids went to the mall, he watched public court cases online, breaking them down like a coach reviewing game tape. Only his mother took him seriously. One night, while folding laundry, she looked at him and said, "You'd make a damn good lawyer." The moment Tiana came home in tears, waving a notice from her landlord, was when it all became real. She was accused of breaking her lease over a noise complaint that wasn't even hers. A neighbor had filed it while Tiana worked a double shift at the hospital. Jaylen knew it smelled wrong, and when she couldn't afford an attorney, he stepped up. He researched, pulled city records, compiled timestamps, security logs, and even secured 2 affidavits from neighbors who'd overheard the property manager discussing plans to clear out Section 8 people by summer. Jaylen was 17 with no driver's license, no car, and no social media, but his binder was thick and his argument solid. He knew he had a legal right under Arizona law to represent a family member in civil court with proper approval. He filed the paperwork, got it notarized, and waited. No one expected much when he showed up in court, but Jaylen didn't walk into a room loudly. He just let silence follow him when he left. Tiana Rowe, 24, worked nights at St. Joseph's Hospital and cared for her younger brother, Kalen, whose severe asthma often kept him out of school. She was responsible, paid her rent on time, and kept her place clean, even when the heat went out in January. But her building was changing. New management had arrived 6 months prior with plans to modernize, which meant higher rent, stricter rules, and a quiet push to remove tenants who didn't fit their vision. The pressure started subtly. Letters for minor violations, random inspections, complaints about excessive noise from tenants who were never home. Then came the February 8 complaint, a noise violation report for loud music, yelling, possible fighting. The only problem was Tiana had clocked into work at 6:45 p.m. that night and didn't leave the hospital until after 7 a.m. the next morning. Kalen had stayed overnight with a friend. They weren't even home. She tried to contest the claim with the property manager, but he shut her down. "We have the right to terminate based on repeated violations. This isn't personal." But it was. 2 other black, single-parent households had already been forced out with similar warnings. No hearings, no questions, just intimidation wrapped in official-sounding letters. That's when she called Jaylen. He was in school, sneaking glances at a legal textbook hidden behind his Chromebook. But when he saw the missed call and the text, "They're trying to evict me by the end of the month," he left class without permission, hopped on a city bus, and showed up at her apartment by dinner. They sat at her kitchen table, bills spread out like playing cards. He listened, wrote things down, and asked questions. Then he pulled out his laptop, created a folder called Roe vs. Holstead MGMT, and started building a case. Emails, timestamps, shift logs, building policies, Arizona's tenant protection laws. He found out the complaint wasn't signed, had no witness, no audio, and no written statement. Just a vague report and an email chain between the building supervisor and the regional property director discussing revitalizing the tenant profile. He even tracked down the neighbor who supposedly filed the complaint, Miss Cheney, apartment 3B, a retired woman with a walker and a garden of potted plants. When he asked her about the complaint, she looked confused. "I don't even know that girl," she said. "I didn't write nothing. I ain't heard nothing either." That was the nail. Jaylen typed up a letter of intent to dispute the violation under Tiana's name. When the property manager didn't respond, he filed a civil complaint for wrongful eviction. A week later they received a court date. When Jaylen showed up with his approval to act as a pro-se representative, the clerk looked at him twice, asked for ID, and verified the paperwork 3 times. It was valid. But paperwork didn't stop prejudice. When they walked into Courtroom 2B that morning, it was as if everyone had already made up their minds. Jaylen wasn't supposed to be there, not dressed like that, not that young, not that confident. But he hadn't come to play dress up. He came to make them regret underestimating him. Knowing the law wasn't enough, now he had to prove he belonged in a room that was doing everything to make him feel like he didn't. "Let's keep this short," Judge Wexler said, straightening papers in front of him. "We've got 3 other cases backed up already." His weariness showed in his sigh and the way he rolled his pen between his fingers. "Mr. Prescott, you may proceed. Try not to turn this into a TED Talk." Jaylen stood up, no papers in hand, just a yellow notepad and a pen tucked behind his ear. "Thank you, Your Honor. Before I begin, I'd like to address the court's assumption that my presence is a novelty." "Objection," the defense attorney interrupted. "Is this an opening statement or a personal grievance?" Jaylen turned his head, calm as ever. "It's context, and I'll move forward." He walked slowly to the front, looked around the courtroom, then focused on Wexler. "This case isn't about noise. It's about power. My cousin, Tiana Rowe, is a working-class tenant in a complex that's being quietly cleared of families that don't fit a certain profile. She was accused of violating her lease while she was clocked in at St. Joseph's, 45 minutes away. No evidence, no signature, just a typed-up report. We're not asking for sympathy, we're asking for facts." The room was still again. You could hear the creak of the bench as someone shifted their weight. Wexler scratched his chin, not amused, not impressed, just annoyed. "And you've got proof of all this?" he asked flatly. "I do." Jaylen reached into his backpack and handed a tabbed binder to the bailiff. Inside were timestamps from Tiana's time card, a statement from Miss Cheney denying the complaint, and building-wide notices showing a pattern of selective enforcement. In one section he printed out an internal email chain, legally acquired through a resident complaint, that showed management discussing a long-term tenant replacement strategy. Wexler flipped through the binder. "Well organized. But you realize that evidence alone doesn't win a case. Jaylen didn't blink. Yes, Your Honor. But facts have a tendency to speak louder than sarcasm. The room shifted. Someone in the gallery choked back a laugh. Wexler leaned back in his chair and stared at Jaylen as if sizing him up for the first time. You think you're clever? No, I think my cousin deserves housing security like anyone else. The defense attorney rose again, clearly annoyed. Objection, Your Honor, he's grandstanding. Overruled, Wexler muttered. He still didn't like the kid, but he was starting to listen. Jaylen continued, addressing the judge directly. In accordance with 33 to 1,367 Argentine pesos, tenants have the right to dispute retaliatory or baseless eviction threats. Ms. Rowe was not issued a formal hearing, was not given a chance to respond in writing, and received no copy of the alleged complaint. These are procedural violations that undermine her rights and place her at risk of homelessness for a noise complaint that never existed. He said that last part slowly, steady and plain. Wexler didn't speak for a while. The defense attorney tried to shift focus, claiming Tiana had a history of behavioral complaints, but Jaylen countered each one with documentation proving they were vague, unsupported, or flat-out false. You came prepared, Wexler said under his breath, more to himself than anyone else. Jaylen didn't smile. He wasn't there for that. He just stood there, calm as ever, hands folded. The hardest part wasn't making his case. It was surviving a system that expected him to fail from the moment he opened his mouth. The courtroom no longer felt the same. What started as entertainment, a kid trying to be a lawyer, was now uncomfortably quiet. People leaned forward instead of laughing. Even the court reporter had stopped typing. Jaylen walked back to the plaintiff's table and opened his binder, flipping to the back. I'd like to call my first witness, he said. Miss Cheney, apartment 3B. The judge blinked. You brought a witness? Yes, Your Honor. She's present and willing to testify. The older woman with the walker, Miss Cheney, slowly stood up from the gallery. Jaylen offered her an arm as she made her way to the front. Once seated and sworn in, Jaylen approached. Miss Cheney, did you file a noise complaint against Miss Tiana Rowe on February 8th? No, I did not, she said without hesitation. Were you asked to? Not directly, but the manager came by earlier that week, asking questions about the younger tenants, said he was trying to clean things up. Did you ever observe Ms. Rowe causing disturbances in the building? Never. That girl works harder than anybody in the building. And did anyone from management inform you a report had been filed in your name? No. First time I heard about it was from this young man right here. Jaylen nodded. No further questions. The defense attorney stood up, but Wexler raised a hand. No need, he said quietly. Let her rest. The room stayed still as Miss Cheney made her way back to the bench with help from the bailiff. Jaylen turned back to the judge. We also have timestamped security footage from the hospital where Ms. Rowe works. It confirms her entry and exit on the date in question. Her supervisor also submitted a signed statement verifying her shift hours. He slid a USB across the table. The courtroom projector came to life. The screen showed a grainy hallway, 6:45 p.m. Tiana walking in, hospital badge around her neck, hair pulled back, scrubs on. Next clip, 7:15 a.m., her exiting the same hallway, shoulders slumped, hair messy, exhaustion on her face. Wexler tapped his pen slowly against his desk. The defense attorney didn't speak, staring at the screen, arms crossed, jaw tight. When the footage ended, Wexler looked at Jaylen. Mr. Prescott, you've made your point. Jaylen didn't relax. He stood still. There's one more thing, he said. He pulled a folded letter from his pocket, unfolded it carefully and handed it to the bailiff. It was from another tenant, Maria Estes, a single mother who had moved out 2 months earlier after receiving 3 vague notices of lease violations. In the letter, she described the intimidation, the letters, and how the property manager told her, "It's easier for everybody if you just leave." The judge read it silently, lips pressed into a thin line. After a long pause, he leaned forward and rested his hands on the bench. I've been on this bench for 19 years, he said slowly, and I've never seen a kid walk in here with this level of preparation, confidence, and evidence, especially not without a law degree. He looked at Jaylen for a long time, then at the defense attorney. You've got a lot to answer for, he told the lawyer. Turning back to Jaylen, he added, your case is compelling. More than that, it's airtight. Jaylen didn't smile. He simply nodded. Thank you, Your Honor. But this wasn't about praise, it was about the fact that no one expected him to make it this far, and yet here he stood, unshaken. The courtroom didn't clap. No one stood. This wasn't a movie, but the energy had shifted. Even the court reporter glanced at Jaylen now with something different in her eyes, something like respect. The defense attorney, Mr. Brian Lell, finally stood up, clutching a folder that suddenly felt thinner than it had that morning. "We'd like to motion for a short recess to review this new material," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. Wexler shook his head. "You've had weeks to prepare. The footage is dated, the letter is signed, you were informed of the witnesses in the case summary." He tapped the bench with his pen. "Motion denied. Continue." Lell walked slowly back to his table, flipping pages as if they'd rearranged themselves. He tried again, pushing for dismissal based on procedural irregularities, but the judge cut him off. "Irregularities like not producing the lease logs when asked?" Wexler said, raising an eyebrow. Silence. Jaylen glanced down at his notepad, then turned to look at Tiana. She sat quietly, hands clasped in her lap, her leg bouncing under the table, but her face was unreadable. He leaned over and whispered, "You okay?" She nodded barely. Back at the bench, Wexler cleared his throat. "Let's be honest here," he said. "This wasn't supposed to be a real case. Not in your mind, Mr. Lell. Not in mine either, if I'm being truthful." Lell shifted. "You thought you'd walk in, call the bluff, and it would be over in 15 minutes. But it turns out this young man did more homework than most third-year associates I've had in front of me." Jaylen didn't react, not out of pride, but because the fight wasn't finished yet. "I'd like to call the building manager," Jaylen said. "Objection." Lell snapped. "He wasn't listed in the—" "He was subpoenaed," responded via email. "The court has a copy of the confirmation," Jaylen replied, flipping to the exact page and sliding it toward the judge. Wexler scanned it, then nodded. "He's in the hallway. Bring him in." The door opened, and in walked a stocky man in his late 30s with a clipboard and an attitude. His name was Phil Hayworth, and he looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. He sat down, took the oath, and folded his arms. Jaylen stepped up. "Mr. Hayworth, can you explain why Ms. Rowe was issued a violation for a complaint that can't be traced to any resident?" "I had a report," Phil said flatly. "From who?" I don't remember the name. It was written down." "Where is it now?" "I don't have it. Might have gotten lost." "You filed a lease violation based on an anonymous claim with no supporting evidence. Is that correct?" "Look, I manage over 100 tenants." "Yes or no?" Phil glanced at the judge, then back at Jaylen. Yes." Jaylen opened the binder to a printout. "Did you write this email to your regional manager on February 10th? We're going to start removing the problematic ones, starting with 2C. They won't fight it?" Phil's eyes widened. That was taken out of context. "What's the context where calling tenants problems is okay?" Silence. "Do you consider working-class tenants a problem?" Phil looked like he wanted to disappear. He looked at the judge, but Wexler didn't blink. "No further questions," Jaylen said. Phil was dismissed. As he walked past the gallery, a few people shook their heads. Miss Cheney stared at the floor. Back at the plaintiff's table, Jaylen sat down slowly. His jaw was tight now, not from nerves but from holding everything in, the anger, the frustration, the exhaustion from staying up all night researching rental codes and legal definitions. It was finally coming out, not in shouts but in facts. But even with the truth on your side, justice isn't guaranteed. Not until someone has the courage to make the room uncomfortable. For a full 10 seconds no one spoke. Wexler sat still, chin resting on one hand, glasses sliding down his nose. He looked like he was seeing the courtroom differently now, like the walls had shifted while he wasn't paying attention. Jaylen stayed seated, not because he was tired, but because standing wasn't necessary anymore. Everything he needed to say had been said. Tiana whispered, "What happens now?" Jaylen didn't answer right away. He just looked at the judge, waiting. Wexler finally sat up straight and cleared his throat. "This court finds the complaint issued against Miss Tiana Rowe to be without merit. The eviction process was initiated without sufficient evidence, with procedural inconsistencies, and with what this court can only describe as a troubling pattern of selective enforcement." The words hit hard not just because they were a win but because they were real, documented, spoken aloud on record. "In addition," Wexler continued, "the court recommends the matter be reviewed by the appropriate housing authority for possible violations of the Arizona Fair Housing Act." Lell tried to interject. "Your Honor, if I may." "You may not," Wexler replied without looking at him. "You had your chance." He turned toward Jaylen, his expression changed, still stern, still formal, but there was something else under it, a pause, a kind of weight behind his voice that hadn't been there before. "Mr. Prescott," he said, I owe you an apology. When you walked into this room, I dismissed you. I saw a hoodie. I saw a teenager. I didn't see an advocate. That was my mistake. Somewhere in the back row, someone murmured, "About time." Wexler didn't flinch. You have demonstrated extraordinary skill, knowledge, and self-control. You defended your family with dignity. You navigated complex legal standards with clarity, and you kept your composure under pressure most adults couldn't handle. Jaylen gave a small nod. I appreciate that, he said quietly. Even Wexler looked down at his paperwork, then back up. This court session is adjourned. The gavel struck once. It was done. No applause, just quiet. Tiana exhaled as if she'd been holding her breath for weeks. Her shoulders dropped. She turned to Jaylen, eyes full but not crying. You did it. He didn't smile. He just stood up, closed his binder, and packed it into his backpack as if it were just another Tuesday. Nothing flashy, nothing loud. The clerk approached him on the way out and tapped his shoulder. Hey, she said, you ever think about taking the bar one day? You've got something. Jaylen gave her the same calm look he gave everyone. Maybe if they'll let me. Outside the courthouse, the air was warmer. People walked past as if nothing had happened inside. Jaylen and Tiana sat on the bench near the bus stop, the same one where they'd waited an hour just a week ago to file the paperwork. She nudged him with her shoulder. Seriously, thank you. He nodded, watching a car pull up and idle at the curb. Just didn't want to see you pushed out for no reason. But how did you even learn all that? He looked down, fiddling with the zipper on his backpack. I had to. Nobody else was going to do it. Tiana didn't say anything. She just leaned back, watching the clouds move over the sun. Jaylen finally cracked a smile, not big but real. You hungry? I'm starving. I got $20. Then you're buying. They both laughed, not loud, but it carried, because in a system that rarely listens, one calm voice, backed by truth, can echo louder than a room full of titles. Some stories don't need explosions to make noise. Sometimes the loudest moment is when a teenager in beat-up sneakers proves that intelligence doesn't come with a dress code, and justice doesn't belong only to those in suits. Jaylen Prescott didn't walk into that courtroom looking like anyone's idea of a hero. But he walked out with something more powerful than approval. He walked out with proof that knowledge can shake a system, that preparation beats perception, and that when you stand up for someone else, even when you're underestimated, disrespected, and talked down to, you can make people see what they've ignored for years. Judge Wexler saw it. The courtroom saw it. And if we're paying attention, we should see it too. Because every neighborhood has a Jaylen. Some quiet kid in the back of the room, some kid who watches more than he talks, who reads, listens, and remembers everything. But the world keeps trying to tell him to sit down, to stay in his lane, to wait his turn. What if he didn't? What if we actually made space for voices like his before they had to fight their way in? If this story made you think even just a little, share it. Talk about it. Ask yourself who gets overlooked in your own life. And if you're the one people keep underestimating, stay ready, stay sharp, speak up when it counts. They'll hear you eventually.